Thank you very much once for inviting me, and I am grateful. It has been very great to join some very respected colleagues of ours and professors from China, Sri Lanka, Sweden, and other parts of the world. I've just sent in a brief message in the chat window, uh, since the topic is on safeguarding the rights to life of vulnerable groups. Our dear professor before did talk about some of the vulnerable groups, and I further expand on that very topic. So, I'll explain it in a way because, as we have talked throughout the meeting as well, that different countries have taken different initiatives, and all the countries cannot be equally taken into account when it comes to the overall strategy of containing the virus or fighting this overall epidemic, since the ground realities everywhere are very different. So, like for instance, if we talk of the epidemic in the context of Pakistan, we must know that it's a very diverse country with very different population and geographic locations. So, for instance, like the province that I come from is land area wise or mass wise the largest when it comes to the land, almost 42% of the country, the province of Balochistan. But the population is quite widespread, so it's not that congested of a population. If you compare the whole province of Balochistan with just the city of Lahore, you would see that the population of the whole province is less than that one city of Lahore. So we look at different vulnerable groups on further expanding on it, starting off with people which we here in simple words call the daily wages, or the people who depend on informal economy. Then we have the people who have inadequate access to social services, and also those people who don't have political influence. Since we say that we live in a democratic country and democracy is here, and then we have a very different political setup with a lot of different political parties and governance structures. So, and the governance structure also varies from province to province, city to city. So if you talk of the federal government based in the capital Islamabad, you would see that the governance structure is very different. So if you go to the province of Balochistan and if you look at the capital city Quetta, the governance structure is entirely different. The same is the case in Sindh. And every province has the right and the power to either impose the lockdown, ease up the lockdown, or whatever strategy that they devise, they can do it on their own. So federal government comes in with little support, uh, in terms of disasters or epidemics like these that we see. Then some of the most uh, vulnerable groups that we have here are people with limited access to technologies or information. So, for instance, there are many areas within the country where information is a problem. Why? Because you hardly get internet access or services. There is no source of information, so which causes problems in the overall awareness campaign regarding such an epidemic, which we saw in the earlier days. Then you might all know that we are a country which hosts a lot of refugees as well. So the refugees who are living in the refugee camps along the borders or within the different locations that have been allocated for them in the past also become one of the most vulnerable groups in such epidemics, and which includes the migrants as well. Then, of course, we have some conflicted zones as well. Conflicted, I would say, where there are some kind of little conflicts. For instance, If you talk of the north of Pakistan, historically there have been military operations against some terrorist groups, including TTP or groups like that. So there are people and populations who live in existing humanitarian emergencies as well. So it makes them even more vulnerable, because even the in such epidemics, because earlier they have been facing a lot of other problems as well, and let alone this epidemic which came in has drastically changed everything, because the priorities of the governments, be it the federal government or the provincial governments, have changed. So there are a few similarities as well in these cases. For instance, Afghanistan is one of the options, and there are other populations, including in our neighboring country like India and other places. So, and then of course, dear Professor Christian did mention about women as well, children as well, who are one of the most vulnerable groups. Of course, they are, and this is the same case here. So if you talk of women, specifically in the context of Pakistan, we do have cases of domestic violence as well. So for instance, once the lockdown came in, the cases of domestic violence also was a big issue for the government, because since everybody was locked down at home, so the cases of domestic violence also increased. So this, the whole canvas gave us, or pointed out, a lot of vulnerable groups, which, because of course a country like Pakistan was never prepared for an epidemic like this. So as we speak, just today, the government of Pakistan has eased up the lockdown. Why? Because whatever reasons they give, or the pressure comes in from the business community or from the overall population, that economically they are going down, down and down. So those pressures developed, and the federal government had to take this decision, although the peak of the virus has yet to come in Pakistan, because it has just started. So we have already crossed cases of 25,000. So we already have more than 25,000 cases in Pakistan, with over 600 deaths reported. So this further, complicates the situation. So, let alone dealing with these issues, I would, of course, focus on our population, division. Since Pakistan is the second largest, country with the most young people in it after Afghanistan. So Pakistan happens to be one of the second youngest countries in this region, with over 60% of the population which is below the age of 30. So this further create unemployment issues for them, because all the organizations that were operating here, or private companies, had to let off a lot of people. For instance, if you talk of even universities, so we have different sectors. Like for instance, we have private sector universities and we have public sector universities. The public sector could take it for a long time, but the private sector universities already, fired a lot of people because they were not needed. So for instance, if they are needed in administrative services, they were taken aboard, and the teachers and the professors who had to teach classes online were taken off. But of course, the private sector can take this decision that they further don't need people. So unemployment on the rise, it creates and makes the young population, including both young males and females, one of the most vulnerable groups, which further adds to the problems of Pakistan. So if we go 6 months from now and we look at the end of 2020, we will have more and more unemployed people, because as per statistics, in normal situations, Pakistan needed 1 million, creation of 1 million jobs per year. So in normal situations, our requirement is that we should be creating 1 million jobs per year annually. But if, now that this epidemic has come, it has further worsened the problems and the situations. Then if you talk of, and then we have very, porous borders. So for instance, if you look at the province of Balochistan, we have a long border with Iran. And then we have a long border with Afghanistan. So, important cases of coronavirus to us did not come from China. So the situation was that there was Islamic pilgrimage and gatherings going on in Iran, and Iran did not inform that the virus has already spread. So the first case which came to Pakistan was identified in Karachi with the history of travel from Iran. So the first case imported to Pakistan was from Iran. So the focus of the government was at the airports checking people, but we somehow missed the overall situation where the people had to come either cross the border or had to use, come by road via Iran. So those cases came, a lot of them came via Iran. And then another religious group, of course, which gets together every year, and they are in hundreds of thousands of people who gather. So the other cases came in from Saudi Arabia. So for instance, and then people had no idea of what the virus was, because there were a lot of myths revolving around it, people never taking it seriously. And there were a lot of conspiracy theories as well roaming around. So it worsened the situation. So this is a kind of a situation that we look at, and it has been causing a lot of problems too, to be very honest, to the federal government as well as to provincial governments. Because if you talk of the province of Balochistan, like for instance, where I come from, you hardly have that much resources or structures. So the governance structure is very weak, which makes the overall population very vulnerable to the virus. One, because they have to work. There are people who depend on daily wages. They earn the same day and they consume it the same day. So the next day they don't have any saving to it. And plus the social service sector is not that well developed. So you have to keep that in account as well. So this is a bit of an overview of what we look at when it comes to the further expansion of the vulnerable groups. And the peak has yet to come, and there are a lot of ideas that how do we look at it, and there have been people with community support that are trying to somehow contain the virus, as well as help and support economically the people, because it further adds to exploitation at from some time from now, because we have had problems from terror groups, this and that. So it makes the overall country a bit vulnerable to such miscreants as well, that who can kind of exploit the situation and taking advantage of the epidemic. So thank you so much.